Good afternoon, Dr. Ngai.
Good afternoon.
When we left off on your testimony yesterday, we were talking about some of the hypotheses that you considered in your evaluation in this case. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
And we had talked about your one hypothesis that you considered, which is that the hypothesis that these wounds that we've been talking about and Ms. Mullis's injuries were caused by someone swinging this corn rake into her body. Do you remember those questions in your testimony about those issues?
Yes.
I want to show you and I've shared these demonstratives with the state, Your Honor. I want to show you, for starters, demonstrative I. Can you rotate this 90 degrees? Actually, let's start with G. Do you see the figures on image G in front of you, Dr. Ngai?
Yes.
And do these figures help you explain your testimony as to why you disproved the hypothesis that someone could not have swung the corn rake into Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes.
Can you explain how how demonstrative G illustrates that?
We were talking about an overhead swing. So this demonstrative, even though it's two-dimensional, shows that with an overhead swing, the angle of entry of the tines does not match the diagnosed wound trajectories.
And is that true for those wounds A through D that have one trajectory and those wounds E through F that have another?
It's true for all of the wounds, yes.
All right. I want to also show you another demonstrative K. Do these images also help explain your testimony that you disproved the hypothesis that someone could have swung the corn rake into Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes.
And can you explain how?
Similarly as the other diagrams do, this is essentially showing an overhead swing, and in various positions of erect to bending over to lying on the ground, the rake entry of the tines don't match the physical evidence, being the wound trajectories.
I want to also show you demonstrative L. Does this demonstrative help illustrate your testimony from yesterday that someone could not have swung, that you disproved the hypothesis that someone caused these injuries or could have caused these injuries by swinging the corn rake into Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes, this is in reference to the lateral swing.
And how does this image illustrate that concept?
Swinging it sideways doesn't generate the wound trajectories diagnosed by Dr. Cruz.
One question I wanted to ask you yesterday, and I know that we talked some about different positions with respect to your testimony about this hypothesis. Would it have been possible to create the wound pattern and the wound trajectories that Ms. Mullis had if the person who caused these injuries was sitting or kneeling?
Sitting or kneeling behind them, you mean?
Let's start with that. Would that have been possible?
So looking at the length of the rake and Mrs. Mullis's anthropometrics and the location of the injury, that would not match, no.
And what about if Ms. Mullis were kneeling or sitting? Would that be possible?
Same thing. The angle of entry wouldn't match the wound trajectories.
Thank you. I think we can take that image down. We talked yesterday about the hypothesis that one or more of the injuries was caused by someone pushing this rake into Amy Mullis's back. And I wanted to ask you if you considered the hypothesis that someone kicked this rake somehow into Ms. Mullis's back to cause these injuries.
I don't recall us talking about the rake being pushed.
All right. Well, let me start by asking you about whether if you consider the hypothesis that someone kicked this rake into Ms. Mullis's back.
Yes.
And what did you determine about whether that hypothesis was possible?
That it's unlikely.
And why is that?
As we discussed earlier yesterday, Ms. Mullis, based on the wound pattern, the spacing of the wounds, as we discussed, she's hyperextended when the injury occurred.
And you described yesterday hyperextending, meaning?
Right, so she's hyperextended, shoulders back, rotated. If someone's on the ground, that is an active position to have to hold. So you'd have to then place the rake in that position, keep the rake there while she doesn't move, and then actively kick it. That is not a feasible hypothesis.
So a second ago, I want to make sure that I spoke correctly. We had talked about the hypothesis that someone pushed Ms. Mullis onto the rake. That's what we discussed yesterday. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes.
All right. I do want to discuss with you this other hypothesis, whether someone pushed this rake into Ms. Mullis's back, meaning they held the rake and pushed it into her. Did you consider that hypothesis?
Yes.
And were you able to prove or disprove that hypothesis?
I was able to disprove it.
How?
That comes into now, if we give the mechanism of the injury, meaning the rake was in the appropriate position to cause the diagnosed wounds, keeping in mind that she's hyperextended, the rake has to be angled obliquely to her body, and the rake handle is essentially parallel with the long axis of her body. Then you have to consider, as I talked about, magnitude. So I considered magnitude at that point.
Did you, and so what were your conclusions about whether it would be possible to have the magnitude of force necessary to cause those injuries through that mechanism?
There is not enough force with this blunt object to push the rake into Ms. Mullis's body.
How do you know that?
Based on my investigation.
And what about your investigation led you to conclude that?
Biomechanical and scientific literature that talks about the penetration threshold for blunt objects into the body.
And what does that literature say about that topic?
What it says is I need about close to 75 pounds of force for one of these tines to enter the body without the clothing. When you add on the clothing, then we're over, 90 pounds. And then the fact that there's 3 tines going in, then you have to distribute the forces, so you're multiplying that now by 3. There is biomechanical literature that talks about the push force, and there's different kinds of pushing. If you're holding it against a body and you're constantly pushing, or you're actually pushing with acceleration. So if you use the pushing with acceleration, that's a more severe scenario compared with the constant push, because now you're adding acceleration in. The maximum push force by males is about 138 pounds. So that is not enough force to penetrate the clothing and her body.
And again, is that true whether someone is applying the constant pushing that you described or doing the pushing with acceleration?
That is true, because if it doesn't meet the threshold with the acceleration, it's not going to meet it with the constant pushing.
Were you able to determine any hypothesis where a person would be able to push the rake into Ms. Mullis's back to cause these injuries?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sure. In considering this hypothesis, the hypothesis of whether these injuries were caused by someone pushing the rake into Ms. Mullis's back, were you able to envision any scenario where that was possible?
No, because that's already, even with 2 tines, were not reaching the necessary threshold. So again, I said a very, very conservative minimum. It's greater than that, is 90 pounds. Multiply that by 2 times, and that's going to be more than 180, and the very maximum push force is less than that.
In the literature that you looked at on this issue, what was the blunt force object that the literature discussed this concept with respect to?
Screwdrivers.
Is that flathead screwdrivers like the screwdrivers we were discussing yesterday?
Yes.
And it was your testimony yesterday that this corn rake is blunter than a flathead screwdriver?
It's blunter than a 1/4 inch wide flathead screwdriver.
Thanks for that clarification. I appreciate that. Did you consider the hypothesis that Ms. Mullis's injuries were caused by Ms. Mullis falling down onto the rake?
Yes.
And could you disprove this hypothesis?
I could not disprove it. Actually, I proved it.
Would looking at a demonstrative assist you in explaining this testimony?
Yes.
All right. I want to show you demonstrative J. Can you explain how it is you determined that you could not disprove the hypothesis that these injuries were caused by Ms. Mullis falling down onto the rake?
So again, we talked about yesterday how lining up the rake with wounds A, B, and C, and D, we know that A, B, and C occurred first from the analysis that I talked about yesterday. So lining up the rake with the rake lying flat on the ground tines up. If you line up those tines with the wound paths, that demonstrates that when she falls, that this generates the mechanism necessary to cause the injury. So now that I showed mechanism, then I analyzed force.
All right, and I want to get to force in a minute, but just sticking with mechanism for a second. You talked yesterday in your testimony about the concept that if someone had pushed Ms. Mullis, so stood and pushed her onto the rake, there would have been rotational forces that would have sent her at least somewhat in a horizontal direction. Do you remember that testimony?
Yes, it's rotational as well as horizontal velocity.
And thank you. Why wouldn't that concept have prevented Ms. Mullis from falling down onto the rake in the way that you're just describing you could not disprove?
Well, when you have horizontal and rotational acceleration that pushes the body across, basically, if you think about parallel to the floor and rotating about that axis, when you contact the rake, because the rake is top heavy, it's going to flip. In the falling situation, when somebody falls from standing height and falls backwards, her body will contact the tines first, and then her lower body essentially pins the rake down with the rake handle down, which prevents it from flipping.
We're talking about a 4-timed rake and 6 wounds. So this hypothesis requires Ms. Mullis to have fallen on this rake more than once. Isn't that right?
Yes.
How could that have occurred from a type of force and direction of force perspective?
Well, as discussed, the A, B, and C wounds are created first because we've excluded that E and F and D being created first for the reasons we talked about. After A, B, and C are created, if her trying to get up, she could roll to her right. The rake handle prevents her from sitting up straight, so sitting on her buttocks because it's too long, it's longer than her torso. So for her to get up, she'd have to roll over. And if you roll over to your right and not to your left, because otherwise you're rolling over the rake, if you roll over to your right, essentially you're causing tensile loading, and you can pull out that tine 3, which is in wound C, because it's not as deep as A and B. Right? Remember that wound C is 3 and I think 1/2 inches deep. So if you can pull wound tine 3 out of wound C, just by attempting to get up and maneuvering, trying to get the rake out of her. The rake stays in the clothes at that point, and in her movement, the rake then moves within the clothes, causing the abrasion above wound D. Even if she gets up onto her hand, she doesn't have to get all the way up to standing, not even to her knees yet, getting up to leaning up on her hand and then falling backwards to get wound D.
I want to stop you right there where you've caused wound D, and I'm going to show you another demonstrative, which is demonstrative F. Does this demonstrative help illustrate your testimony about how Ms. Mullis could have fallen on this rake more than once?
Yes.
And can you explain how it does that?
Yes. So basically, her pulling on the rake handle to try and extract the rake from her body reorients the tines upward. With A and B still in her body, that is then consistent with the tines moving around, as Dr. Hammers discussed yesterday, with the external and internal wound pattern showing that the tines are moving, tines 1 and 2 are moving in wounds A and B. Once you reorient the rake and she falls on it, then you have the mechanism to generate E and F.
From the data that you had from Dr. Cruz and Dr. Hammers about the pattern of wounds A for F, did this hypothesis match?
It matches everything, yes.
And from the depth of the wounds as measured by Dr. Cruz, did this hypothesis match?
Yes, the A and B are deepest, and they stayed within her, and E would be the next deepest.
In terms of the physical characteristics of the rake and the spacing of the rake's tines, does this hypothesis match for all of Ms. Mullis's wounds on wounds A through F?
Yes.
You had talked earlier about Ms. Mullis's clothing. From your investigation and analysis of the clothing, did this hypothesis work?
Yes, with the less holes in the clothes relative to the holes in her body, and understanding that tine 3 doesn't come out of the clothing to cause wound D, yes, it all fits.
And from the issue that you were discussing a minute ago of Ms. Mullis's back being hyperextended, at least on the right side, does that fact and that concept, does that fit with this hypothesis?
Yes, even when you move the rake in this position that we see here, you reorient the rake handle down by her left hip, trying to extract it. That'll cause, again, the back skin to basically compress together.
From your review of the layout of the shed and the physical characteristics of the shed, did this hypothesis fit?
Yes.
How?
The small spacing, there's not a lot of room in there. So we talked about that for the swinging scenarios. But there is enough room to fall and refall on this implement.
Were you aware of evidence in the record that there was blood on Ms. Mullis's hand and blood on the handle of the rake?
That's what I reviewed in the records, yes.
And did that information fit with this hypothesis?
That fits with this hypothesis, yes.
How does it?
So she has to grab the handle to reorient the handle in the manner that we see in this figure in order to sustain E and F. So grabbing that handle with blood on her hand would transfer to the handle.
You told us a moment ago that, and I think discussed this yesterday, that first you have to determine the type and the direction of the force to determine if those mechanism issues fit with the hypothesis. And is it your testimony that those factors fit with this hypothesis?
Yes, the type and direction of forces in this fall scenario fits with all the injuries.
All right, and in your method of analysis, you would then go on to determine this question of magnitude, whether there could be enough force here to cause the injuries in this hypothesis. Is that right?
Yes.
So in the hypothesis you've described, we're talking about a couple of different kinds of falls. Is that right?
Yes.
What kinds of falls are we thinking about in this hypothesis?
I analyzed a fall from standing, a fall from a lower height attempt while she's trying to attempt to get up the first time, and a fall from say, knee height if she's trying to get the rake out.
You were here for Dr. Cruz's testimony that she did not believe that a fall could be enough to cause these kinds of injuries. Did you hear that testimony?
Yes.
From a magnitude perspective, whether the fall from standing, a fall from kneeling could cause these injuries, what is your conclusion as a biomechanical engineer?
That there is sufficient amount of force.
And how do you make that determination?
Using engineering and laws of physics.
And can you tell, did you have to perform calculations to figure that out?
Yes.
So tell us what you did to make that determination.
So the fall height, calculating a fall height from standing height, you consider conservation of energy principles. So the gravitational potential energy has to equal the kinetic energy. So the law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form to another. So at the height of the fall, that is the potential energy. And as she's falling, you can calculate the kinetic energy using rotational energy combined with linear energy. Once you have that, you can isolate for the velocity, and then estimating a stopping distance, you can calculate an impact force.
And to make those determinations about what those different factors were that go into this consideration, were you relying on principles of engineering, of biomechanical engineering in your field?
Principles of fundamental engineering and science, yes.
All right. And so for the fall from the standing height first, would the force have been of a great enough magnitude to allow Ms. Mullis to be impaled on this rake?
Yes.
And what about from the lower height that you described, from being on her knees?
From you mean the first time she tries to roll over, or which one?
So in the hypothesis you've described, the first time that Ms. Mullis would have fallen on the rake in this hypothesis, she's falling from a standing height. Is that right?
Yes.
And for a later fall, I think as you described, she would be falling from a lower height. Is that right?
Yes.
And so what about from that lower height? When you did this calculation about the magnitude of the force, would there have been enough force generated in this hypothesis to have caused these injuries in the way that you've described?
Yes.
During your investigation, did you come across any physical evidence that did not fit with this hypothesis of Ms. Mullis falling onto the rake in the way that you've described?
No, every single piece of physical evidence supported this hypothesis.
Just one moment, Your Honor. In the hypothesis that you've described that you couldn't disprove, you described the rake tines that caused wound A and B, which I think your testimony came first. In this hypothesis would have stayed in Ms. Mullis's body as she tried to get up. Is that right?
Yes, so A, B, and C happened first, and A and B stay within her body.
All right, and taking that factor into account, testing the hypothesis of how this has occurred, you were able to determine in that scenario that there was enough force to have caused first the fall from a greater height and then the falls that you described that would have been from a lower height.
Yes.
Now, you heard Dr. Cruz's testimony earlier this week that she did not perform any experiments in reaching her conclusion that a fall would not have made these injuries possible. Did you hear that testimony?
Yes.
have you conducted an analysis that allows you to reach the opinion that that hypothesis can't be disproven?
I've done an investigation that not only can't disprove it, but actually proves it.
And have you worked with forensic pathologists in conducting biomechanical evaluations in other cases?
Oh, yes, for sure.
The hypothesis that you've testified that you can't disprove, is that hypothesis unlikely from a biomechanical or a biomedical perspective?
No, it's completely feasible. We've analyzed all the work that went into this investigation to consider all the physical evidence, including the diagnosed wounds externally and internally, the measurements and dimensions and geometry and, again, intrinsic properties of the rake. Everything fits. So not only does the magnitude match, the mechanism matches, it all matches.
Just one moment, Your Honor.
It's not far-fetched at all.
I'm sorry, one moment, Your Honor. Just two other questions, Dr. Ngai. Is there anything in the opinions that you've given here yesterday and today in your testimony that is based on new science that's been developed since 2019?
No.
And are these opinions that you or someone else in the biomechanical field could have offered back in 2019 based on the state of the science then?
Yes.
All right. I have no other questions at this time, Your Honor.